The desert sun hung high over the Nevada Air Base, glinting off the sleek silver skin of an F-22 Raptor that refused to roar. Engineers in grease, stained uniforms swarmed around the fighter jet, their brows drenched in sweat, their voices clipped with frustration. For weeks, the world's most advanced aircraft had been grounded its heart. A titanium marvel of engineering had gone silent. Every test failed, every fix unraveled. Millions of dollars in expertise, equipment, and manpower had been poured into the jet, yet its engine coughed like a wounded beast and died every single time. The upcoming demonstration for the Department of Defense was only 48 hours away, and failure was not an option. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the strength of human spirit, take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe to Kindness Journal. Because sometimes miracles don't come from machines, they come from people who have already been broken and rebuilt. The base commander, Colonel Raymond Steele, a hardened man with decades of flight experience and a voice like gravel, stared at the grounded jet in disbelief. The Raptor had always been his pride, a symbol of American excellence, precision, power, perfection. But this one, aircraft 1472, had become a nightmare. Every expert from Lockheed to the Pentagon had weighed in. The verdict was unanimous. The engine's internal synchronization system was misaligned, something no one could diagnose without dismantling it completely, a process that would take weeks, maybe months. Time they didn't have. That night, as the desert wind whispered across the hangars, Steele sat alone in his office, the orange sunset reflecting in his weary eyes. He flipped through the old maintenance rosters, searching for anything, any name that might spark a last chance. That's when he paused on one line. Master Sergeant Luke Brennan, retired, Engine Division, F-22 Development Program. Steele remembered him vaguely, a quiet mechanic, the kind of man who didn't talk much but always delivered. Brennan had been part of the early design tests before leaving the Air Force 7 years ago under difficult circumstances. Steele frowned. The record noted a medical discharge and a hardship clause, single parent, widowed. The next morning, Steele made the call himself. In a modest neighborhood 2 hours from the base, Luke Brennan was fixing an old pickup truck in his driveway. The tools were worn, his hands were scarred, and a streak of gray ran through his dark hair that hadn't been there when he'd worn the uniform. His 10-year-old son, Max, sat nearby with a lunchbox and a sketchpad, drawing airplanes. The phone buzzed, and when Luke heard the familiar voice of a commanding officer from the past, his chest tightened. "Brennan?" Steele said bluntly, "I need your help. We've got an F-22 down. No one can figure out what's wrong with the engine. They say it's unfixable, but I remember you could hear an aircraft breathe. You were different." Luke's eyes dropped to the concrete, where a single wrench glinted in the sun. He hadn't set foot on a base since his wife's passing, since the day everything fell apart. The Air Force had been his life, but after losing her in a car accident, he couldn't balance the grief and raising Max alone. The sound of jet engines had become a painful reminder of what he'd lost. "Sir," he said quietly, "I'm not that man anymore." But Steele's voice softened. "Maybe, or maybe you're the only man left who can save this jet and remind us what we stand for." That night, Luke sat with Max at the kitchen table, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. His son looked up with curious eyes. "Dad, will you fix a jet again?" Luke smiled faintly. "Maybe one last time." Max nodded. Mom would be proud. That simple sentence hit deeper than any order ever could. The following morning, Luke arrived at the Nevada base in a borrowed pickup, carrying only a toolbox that had seen better days. The young engineers glanced at him with doubt, a man in worn jeans and a faded Air Force jacket, not the image of cutting-edge expertise. But when he stepped into the hangar, his gaze locked on the grounded F-22, and something inside him shifted. The plane wasn't just a machine. It was alive, wounded, waiting, like a soldier that had lost its voice. He ran his hand along the fuselage, whispering to himself, "Let's see what you're trying to tell me." For the next 12 hours, Luke worked silently, methodically. He didn't rely on diagnostic software or digital scanners. He listened. The engineers watched in disbelief as he traced the hum of the auxiliary unit, the faintest tremor in the air, the irregular vibration that others had missed. "It's not the sync system," he murmured. "It's resonance. She's breathing out of rhythm." He crawled beneath the jet, adjusted a sensor no one had touched in months, and found a microscopic crack near the fuel modulator, invisible to the naked eye, but enough to disrupt the engine's heartbeat. He remembered how the early prototypes had suffered similar issues, and how he and his late wife, an aerospace engineer, had worked side by side solving them before she died. The memory made his hands tremble, but he steadied himself. He wasn't just fixing metal, he was fixing a part of himself. When he requested to start the engine, Steele stood behind the safety line, arms crossed. "You're sure about this?" he asked. Luke nodded. "She's ready." The hangar filled with anticipation. The switch was thrown. For a few seconds, silence, then the engine roared to life, smooth, steady, powerful. The sound was pure thunder, echoing off the steel walls like a triumphant heartbeat. The engineers erupted into cheers, some even clapping Luke on the back. But Luke just stood there, eyes glistening, listening to the jet he'd resurrected. For the first time in years, he felt whole. Steele approached, voice thick with gratitude. "You just saved this project and my career. How did you know?" Luke smiled faintly. She wasn't broken. She was just forgotten. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Luke drove home with Max beside him. The boy's eyes sparkled. "Did you fix it, Dad?" Luke nodded. "Yeah, buddy, she's flying tomorrow." Max grinned. "Can we watch?" Luke smiled. "Wouldn't miss it." The next day, the airbase came alive with the sound of jet engines. The F-22 Raptor, freshly restored, stood gleaming on the runway. Pilots saluted as it taxied out, engines humming perfectly. Luke and Max watched from a distance, standing near the fence line. When the jet lifted off the ground and soared into the blue sky, Luke felt tears blur his vision. It wasn't just metal and fire, it was redemption. A reminder that even when something feels too broken to fix, sometimes all it needs is someone who still believes in it. After the flight, Steele approached Luke with an envelope. "We can't pay back what you gave us, but we can offer this a reinstatement, if you want it. The team could use someone like you again." Luke looked down at his son, who was smiling proudly. "Sir," he said softly, "I already got my job back being his dad." But before he left, Luke placed his hand on the plane one last time. "Thank you," he whispered, as if to his wife, to the sky, to life itself. Weeks later, Luke opened his mailbox to find a letter stamped with the Air Force insignia. Inside was a certificate of commendation signed by Steele himself. Beneath it was a note written in Steele's hand, for teaching us that machines are built by skill, but saved by heart. Luke framed it and placed it beside a photo of his wife on the mantel. From that day forward, whenever he heard the distant roar of a fighter jet, he didn't feel pain anymore. He felt peace, the kind that comes only after you've faced your past and forgiven yourself. Life slowly began to brighten again. Luke opened a small garage that specialized in restoring classic aircraft engines. It became a local legend, not for its size or profit, but because every jet that came out of that hangar ran like it, had been given a second chance. He hired veterans, men and women, who had struggled to find their footing after service, giving them purpose and belonging. Above the entrance, he hung a simple sign that read, "Built with honor, repaired with heart." People came from across the country to see the man who had done what the experts couldn't, but Luke always shrugged off the praise. "I didn't fix that jet alone," he'd say. My wife's memory guided my hands, and my son reminded me why I still needed to try. Years later, Max would follow in his father's footsteps, studying aerospace engineering and joining the Air Force himself. When he graduated, he handed his father a photo, the same F-22 soaring in the sky, framed by clouds. On the back, he had written, "For the man who taught me that engines and people can always be repaired." Sometimes life gives us broken things not to test our strength, but to remind us how to care again. Luke Brennan wasn't just the man who repaired a jet, he was the man who rebuilt faith in himself and in others. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to Kindness Journal. Let's remind the world that every act of belief, every second chance can change a life. And before you go, tell us in the comments, do you believe that some things are never truly broken, just waiting for the right hands to bring them back to life?